In China, the struggle continued. The reopening of the land bridge had to be accomplished. In the early part of 1944, the Supreme and Deputy Supreme Allied commanders met and laid out a plan of action for this reopening. The British Indian 14th Army in the Arakan, in order to hold the southern front more effectively, was to extend its frontier lines down the Akyab Peninsula. Simultaneously, Stilwell's Lido forces of Americans and Chinese were to speed up the Lido Road campaign with a drive on the strongholds of Mogong and Myitkyina. To aid in this purpose, the American marauders, led by Merrill, were placed under Stilwell. A third coordinating operation was a penetration from the air, in which Wingate's British and Indian Chindits were to be flown into the heart of Burma to land behind and cut enemy supply lines. For the fourth and last phase of the plan, the Chinese Yunnan force would strike from the China-Burma border across the mountains and jungles of the Salween River area in order to reopen the Burma Road for a juncture with the Lido Road. Now the plans were laid, and the stage set for the reopening of the Burma land bridge. The first step was taken on the Arakan front, when the 14th began its march down the Akyab Peninsula. The Army moved rapidly toward the towns of Mongdaw and Buthadong. However, the Japs succeeded in carrying out a flanking movement on our lines of communication, and, moving by night, seized the Nagaduk Pass, through which went the main road connecting our forward troops with the rear. For some time, it looked as though they had succeeded in cutting off a complete advanced division. From the air, RAF bombers opened an attack on the Jap positions in the Nagaduk Pass. Meanwhile, the 7th Indian Division, using tanks for the first time in this campaign, attacked the same objective in that vital pass. The 7th Indian Division finally succeeded in clearing the pass and relieving the beleaguered troops. Once again, our lines of communication were reopened. By the time the monsoon broke on the southern front in June, the 14th Army had destroyed nearly 7,000 of the Japs' finest troops, and it extended Allied lines to form a powerful defense block. The second blow for the reopening of the land bridge was struck by the Lido force in an offensive to push the Lido Road through Mogong to Myitkyina. To aid in the drive on Myitkyina, the American marauders acted as a flanking force, harassing the enemy in a series of left hooks. These marauders were seasoned jungle fighters, veterans of Guadalcanal, New Britain, and New Guinea. Men gathered together by a message which read, "The President of the United States has called for volunteers from experienced jungle troops for a dangerous and hazardous operation somewhere." On March 5th came the third blow, an aerial penetration of Burma. The plan was to fly a detachment of American engineers in gliders 200 miles into enemy-occupied territory and land them on jungle strips, which they would convert into airfields. Once these airfields were prepared, transport planes would fly in a force of Chindits. Patrols would then fan out, cut Jap communication lines, and harass the enemy from the rear. British General Wingate, in command of the Chindits, arrived at Lalagat to discuss final plans with American Colonel Phil Cochran of No. 1 Air Commandos. D-Day. Rows of nylon tow ropes were carefully laid out, ready for the takeoff of dozens of twin-towed gliders. Supplies of all kinds were loaded, including bulldozers and equipment for the use of the American engineers in constructing airstrips in the jungle. The pilots and crews gathered to hear final instruction from Colonel Cochran.
Now, is there anything anybody doesn't know? If there is, let's get it straight now. Okay, now just before I came over here, I had our final meeting with the British ground troops that you're going to take in there tonight. And I talked to the guy that's got the red flare that you know is going to be shot off if there's too much interference with the first few gliders that land. And he tells me that that flare's in an awful deep pocket and it's going to take somebody an awful lot of finding to get at it. So, if those guys have got that kind of heart and they got that kind of guts, it's up to us to get them in there so they can do their job and get them in right. Now tonight, your whole reason for being, your whole existence is going to be jammed up into a couple minutes, and it's just going to balance it there, and it's going to take your character to bring it through. Now, nothing you've ever done before in your life means a thing. Tonight, you're going to find out you've got a soul. Good luck.
The transport stood ready for takeoff. Gliders were lined up. Suddenly, there appeared in the sky above a plane returning from a last-minute reconnaissance flight. Something was wrong. Photos revealed that the main field was hopelessly obstructed. Tree trunks and logs had been strewn over it so that glider landings on this field were impossible. The troops waited for Cochrane and Wingate to make a decision. It wasn't long in coming. Within 15 minutes, they were climbing into the gliders. An alternative strip known as Broadway was now to be the main airbase. At dusk, the first planes took off, each transport towing twin gliders. And within them, men sat silently, grimly, waiting for what lay ahead. When the sun rose over Broadway, it revealed a field littered with wounded gliders. There were wounded men, too, and some beyond wounds. The first glider had bumped to a halt on a field rutted by buffalo bogs and elephant footprints, and strewn with large teakwood logs, hidden from the eyes of reconnaissance cameras by the tall grass. A second glider came in, then a third. They followed one another so fast that it was impossible to clear the field of obstructions and direct gliders. The wounded were tended on the field. Patrols fanned out through the jungle to give protection to the small band of engineers and wounded. They buried their dead in the Burmese jungle. Their Burmese padre read the last rites, and his words mingled with the sound of bulldozers and tractors leveling the field for the arrival that night of the first flight of transports, carrying the remainder of the airborne troops. By that afternoon, the engineers had completed their work. Broadway was open for business. That night and for 6 successive nights, RAF and American pilots of the Troop Carrier Command, led by Brigadier General William D. Old, flew back and forth between Lalagat and the jungle strip of Broadway, which became a base from which patrols of Chindits fanned out in all directions. With the arrival of RAF Spitfires and American P-51s on Broadway, air protection was made available to cover operations. But the enemy struck back. 8 days after our troops had landed, Broadway was attacked by Zeros in a series of raids. American and British planes landed and took off within close range of the Japs. The enemy succeeded in capturing the far end of the field, but were held there by Allied ground and air fighters, their wings armed with bazookas. Died down as the guns of the enemy were silenced and its troops forced back into the jungle. General Wingate had paid one of his many visits to Broadway about this time. On his return flight to his base, his plane crashed in the jungle in Assam. Broadway, an airfield carved out of the jungle, stood as a fit memorial to General Charles Ord Wingate. Early in March, the Japs made an attempt to regain the initiative. They moved 3 divisions to the Chindwin River, crossed it, and struck at Imphal in India, in a powerful pincher movement aimed at cutting the Bengal-Assam Railway, carrying supplies to the Allied troops in northern Burma. Headlines all over the world blazed the news that Jap armies were on Indian soil, that India had been invaded. The announcements, as usual, were premature. But the Allied situation, nevertheless, was extremely grave. Reinforcements were desperately needed. Once again, transports of the American Troop Carrier Command were called in. An entire Arakan division with mules and supplies were carried 230 miles by air from one fighting front to another. By the beginning of April, one Japanese force was 8 miles from Imphal, while another had advanced on Kohima. They cut the roads surrounding Kohima, including the Manipur Road, the 14th Army's main supply line. At Kohima, a small hill station, a garrison of British and Indian infantry dug in and held on to a hill position overlooking the town. Conserving ammunition, the garrison held on. Daily transports brought over ammunition, food, water, and vital medical necessities. The hill soon became known to the troops as Parachute Hill. For 13 days, the garrison held out against a force 3 times its strength. Slowly, relieving forces began to arrive. Until finally, the infantry could take the initiative. The Jap had suffered a costly defeat. However, before the Jap attempt to cut their supply lines failed, the Lido force and the Marauders had continued their drive. The Chinese were now in the Mogong Valley, advancing on the important enemy supply base of Mogong. The Marauders, in their 700-mile march, were moving on the town of Michino, with its strategically valuable air base. The attack on Mogong began at dawn of the 23rd of June. The Chinese forces advanced from the north. While a Chindit force that had pushed up from Broadway struck from the southwest. By the second day, the railway station was occupied. Then, on the third day, the Chinese and Chindit forces linked up. Meanwhile, the Marauders, reinforced by Chinese troops, had marched for days in their drive toward the airfield at Michino. The enemy was apparently taken by surprise and withdrew to the town 2 miles east. Over the air went 2 words: cafeteria lunch, the code signal indicating that Michino Air Base was in Allied hands. Within 1 hour of its capture, gliders flew over, bringing engineers to repair and improve the field. They floated down to make rough and dangerous landings under fire from the town. The engineers went to work as Chinese troops manned defense positions around the field. The monsoon started and driving rain made the task of the engineers doubly difficult. Stilwell arrived for a conference with Merrill. Now, with the elimination of enemy interception from Michinaw, cargo planes could fly to Kunming in China on the southerly and more direct route, at lower altitudes and with increased tonnage. However, before the airbase could be operated effectively, the enemy had to be routed from the town. Michinaw was pounded from the air by fighters and bombers. On the ground, American marauders and Chinese troops pounded the town with what little artillery they had. It was a long siege, 78 days, which finally ended in the complete destruction of the Jap forces defending the town. While the advance on Michinaw was taking place, the fourth Allied blow was struck. A thrust from the China-Burma border through the Salween River area by the Yunnan Chinese Expeditionary Force. The object of this blow was to clear the way for the eventual linking up of the Burma and Lido roads. To accomplish their task, two Jap strongholds, Lungling and Tengchung, had to be taken. On the morning of May 11th, the offensive started. 5 Chinese columns, together with a U.S. Army operations staff, crossed the Salween River. And moved on to the world's highest battleground, the Kaoli Mountains, spur of the Himalayas. For days, they struggled up precipitous slopes until they sighted one of their goals, Tengchung. The siege began. Jap soldiers driven from pillboxes streaked for cover, but machine guns picked them off as they ran. Chinese wounded were carried back over the wrecked walls. There were no Jap wounded, only dead, except for a handful of prisoners. Tengchung fell, then Rungling, and the Chinese and American flags flew over these two key strongholds. The B-29s that had come to China and India were striking at Burma, Sumatra, Java, Manchuria, flying the longest missions ever undertaken. Finally, they struck at the heart of the Japanese homeland and dropped their bombs on Tokyo. But the Japs struck back in a new China offensive. The American air bases that had been built in that country with such vast effort were in danger of being overrun by the enemy. There was barely time to destroy supplies and installations. One air base after another fell before the onslaught. Once again, roads and rails were packed with fleeing refugees. The offensive grew in strength until it had cut China in half. Now, unless supplies could be rushed through as never before, China faced total defeat. Tonnage over the hump was increased at a terrific rate. The pipeline that was already feeding the Allies in northern Burma pushed on so that it could feed the Allies in China. And on the Lido and Burma roads, with enemy opposition being cleared away, the engineers raced at top speed to reach the point where the two roads would meet. On a historic day in January, Brigadier, later Major General Pick, commander of the Lido Road construction, met Lieutenant General Dan I. Sultan, who had succeeded General Stilwell as commanding officer of the India-Burma Theater.
General Sultan, the Lido Road's open. We have a convoy formed. I'd like your permission to take it through to China.
The first convoy was on its way from India to China, across the 1,044 miles of the newly completed Lido-Burma Road, now called the Stilwell Road, in tribute to the man who had dedicated himself to the building of this great project. After a 24-day journey, the convoy arrived safely in Kunming. The Allies, British, Indian, Chinese, American, had fought, toiled, and bled. And now at last, China's land bridge had been rebuilt. Aid had come to China.